So I'd like to welcome you to the Adversity Advantage podcast, where we will help you use obstacles, failures, and setbacks to give you that edge needed for success. I'll be interviewing people from all walks of life on how they overcame trials and turned them into triumphs. So please sit back, relax, and get ready to be absolutely blown away by some of the wisdom and stories you're about to hear. Welcome back to another episode of the Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst. And today on the show, we're going to be talking about something that's extremely important and relevant right now, and that is mental health. And it's no secret this pandemic has severely impacted people's mental health. Many have lost their jobs and taken a massive hit financially. Addiction's up and alcohol sales have skyrocketed. Depression, anxiety, stress levels, and sleep have all been affected too. And isolation can really cause a ton of havoc on us mentally as it limits our ability to connect with one another. And we are meant to thrive in community. Community is not only good for our mental health, it's also good for our physical and emotional health as well. So with that being said, I wanted to bring on Lori Gottlieb to chat about how you can improve your mental health right now. And for those who don't know who Lori is a psychotherapist and author of the New York Times bestselling book, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, which is being adapted as a television series with Eva Longoria. In addition to her clinical practice, she writes the Atlantic's weekly Dear Therapist advice column and contributes regularly to the New York Times and many other publications. Her recent TED Talk is one of the top 10 most watched of the year. She is a sought-after expert in media, such as the Today Show, Good Morning America, CBS This Morning, CNN, and NPR's Fresh Air. And she is also the co-host of the new iHeartRadio podcast, Dear Therapist, which is produced by Katie Couric. And in this episode, Lori walks us through her incredible story, the effects of isolation on mental health, and some steps we can all take to improve it. So I'm extremely excited to welcome Lori Gottlieb to the Adversity Advantage podcast. Lori, thank you so much for coming on.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to me, your story and everything that you've been able to accomplish in your life. And, from being in the media and then, journaling and, man, you picked the best. I was like Yale, Pepperdine, and Stanford to go to. So you really crossed the ball off. But we were talking before we were recording on the pandemic and mental health. And it's something I'm really passionate about. I know you are as well. What are your thoughts on what, isolation is doing to people's mental health and how it's leading them into, other poor habits and perhaps other addictions?
Right. Well, I think as humans, we want to be connected to other people. And even in pre-COVID times, I think there was sort of this epidemic of loneliness happening. I would see it with my patients. I write about it a lot in the patients that I follow, and Maybe You Should Talk to Someone. And, even the title of the book, by the way, Maybe You Should Talk to Someone, doesn't necessarily mean maybe you should talk to a therapist. It means maybe we need to talk more to one another. And I think that a lot of the times what happens is we're so, kind of distracted by all of these things that are not nourishing to us. And we don't realize how disconnected we are. And then we say, oh, I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling sad, or I'm feeling angry, or I'm having, difficulty in my relationships, or I'm having insomnia or addiction, or, whatever is happening, that we're looking for something else to fill the hole of what really needs to be where connection would go. And so I think during this time right now, people are really struggling because they didn't have a lot of practice and they didn't sort of cultivate those connections. And now I think that if there's any silver lining at all to this pandemic that we're in right now, it's that people are really saying, wait a minute, I need to prioritize the connections in my life, and I need to prioritize the connections that matter. So who is important to me and why? And what are some of the connections that maybe weren't so nourishing to me?
Yeah, I think this has been a really big eye-opener for a lot of people. And you're right, for that, being okay, I have all this time, I have all this isolation to myself. Who do I need to really reconnect with that has been meaningful in my life? Because as a society, we're always so distracted. It's between sporting events and between work and between, different social events and everything else. I think it creates this overwhelm for our brain and overstimulation where we forget about the value of connecting with other people. But, the one thing I wanted to ask you about was, you have an incredible story of being able to not only go through being an executive at NBC, and then going on to being a commentator for NPR, and then going into journalism and all that stuff. But then you decided to become a therapist. So where did that come from? Like, you have this job where you're working with like ER and Friends, and then you're on NPR, which is arguably like the biggest radio job there is. Like, why therapy?
Yeah. So, I wasn't one of those people who, when I was young, said, I'm going to grow up and become a therapist. That never would have crossed my mind. Although, in retrospect, it makes sense because I was always interested in the human condition. And I was also always interested in story because I
Mm,
think that we share our experience through story. We make sense of our lives through story. Whenever you talk to a friend and you're telling them something, you're telling them a story. And that's your version of a story. When people come into therapy, we're all unreliable narrators and we're all sort of telling our version of a story. And sometimes it's a faulty narrative and it needs some editing. But that's how we make sense. Cave drawings were stories, right? So that's how we communicate. And so when I started working, I started working in the entertainment business because I loved story and I loved the human condition. And so whether that was through film and later through television, I really felt like the reason that you watch those shows, the reason that they make you laugh or cry is because these stories are about being human. And then when I was working on ER, I spent a lot of time in a real ER because we used that time to do research. And our consultant on the show, who was an ER physician, said, I think you like it better here than you like your day job. And I was like, I'm not leaving my job and going to medical school. I was a French major, like,
right.
like I'm not doing that. But I was also sort of like a math science person too. And I just hadn't really done that since school. And so I ended up going up to Stanford for medical school. And when I got there, managed care was just coming into play. And I realized that I wasn't going to be able to really spend time with my patients in the way that I wanted to. And so I started writing. And I started writing in a way, I think, to help people to tell their stories. And I left medical school to become a journalist. And it was after working as a journalist that I thought, you know what, I first of all, talking about connection, I had a baby and I felt really disconnected from other adults during the day. Like, I loved my child, but I think any new parent can relate to that feeling of just, I need connection with
Mm,
other people who can speak. you know?
right. Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah. Of
um,
course.
and so the UPS guy would come and he'd like, I would detain him when he would bring packages. I'd be like, how about those diapers? And he just, backed away to his big brown truck. And then he started tiptoeing to my door and like gently putting the package down so I would not open the door and try to talk to him. And we later became very good friends, by the way, which is told in the book. But I realized I needed to do something. So I called up the dean at Stanford Medical School and I said, maybe I should come back and do psychiatry. And she said, you're welcome to come back, but you'd be doing mostly medication management. And you really want those longer term, deeper connections. So why don't you get a graduate degree in clinical psychology and then you can do the kind of work that you've always talked about doing. And that's what I did. And I feel like I went from telling people stories as a journalist to helping people to change their stories as a therapist. And I think that I still do both. I still, I write books, I have a weekly column, I have a podcast, and I have a clinical practice. And I think everything I do is about story and the human condition.
Yeah, and I think what really is fascinating to me is that whole notion of you being able to help your patients rewrite their stories. Because as somebody who's been in therapy, I've spent a lot of time in therapy. You know, sometimes just talking to somebody, yeah, it helps, but that's only part of it. The other part is, how can I change the narrative? How can I change the story I'm telling myself to then move forward in a positive way so that I can rewrite my future? And I'm not just in the same cycle of like blaming and talking and blaming and talking. So how do you really get your patients to kind of rewrite their stories, patients, clients, whatever you call it, like in such a way that is easy and efficient for them to kind of pick up on it?
Yeah. So I think that's the difference between what we get out in the world and what we get in therapy. And I write about that in the book, the difference between idiot compassion and wise compassion.
Right.
So idiot compassion is what we do with our friends. Our friends will tell us a story like, here's what happened and here's what the other person did. And we'll say, yeah, you were right. They were wrong. That's terrible. Right. And it
Yeah.
just reinforces our very narrow view of a particular situation. And so, and if you listen to your friends, by the way, tell their stories over time, you realize, wait a minute, they're telling me the same story, just with different characters and maybe a
Mm.
different scenario. But it's the same thing where like someone, like they have no responsibility or role in this story. Like things are just happening to them. It's kind of like if a fight breaks out in every bar you're going to, maybe it's you. But we don't say that to them.
They were always the
Right?
common denominator when we don't realize it sometimes, you know?
Right, right. And so we're not saying, I've seen this happen with your last 3 jobs. I've seen this happen with your last 3 relationships,
Yeah.
or you keep telling me this keeps happening in your marriage or whatever it is, right? Or with your kid. And so what you get in therapy isn't idiot compassion, but you get wise compassion. And wise compassion is where we hold up a mirror to you and help you to see something about yourself that maybe you haven't been willing or able to do before. And that's where the rewriting comes in. So someone comes in and they say, here's what happened. And, usually they want something to change.
Mm.
And yet they don't realize that they're going to need to change. They want someone else or something else to change. And so they want my help in getting someone else to change. Right. And what they come to realize is that, of course, there are difficult people. I remember when I was training, one of my supervisors said, before diagnosing someone with depression, make sure they aren't surrounded by assholes.
Yeah,
Right.
I've seen
So,
that. I've seen that quote floating around. I think I saw Mel Robbins. Somebody post something about it maybe yesterday. I forget. That's funny
oh,
that
you're
you say that.
kidding.
Yeah, somebody
Wow.
posted something like that. I don't remember who it was, but I saw somebody post something. Yeah, it's so true because I believe you are who you surround yourself with. But go on with the story. Yeah, so your supervisor was telling you that, and
Right. So
then
there are, right. And the point is that of course there are difficult people and there are people like that. But then the question is, what is your role in that? Where is your agency? So do you want to be in relationship with that person? And if you have to be for various reasons, it's a family member and whatever it is, how do you want to redefine that relationship? And how do is there something that you're doing in the way that you react to that person? So
mm,
they might do what they do, but you have lots of choices about how you respond. And so if you reenact the same scene over and over, they do this, you respond in the same way you've been doing for 10 years or 20 years or whatever, nothing's going to change.
mm,
And so therapy can really help you to say, what's going on? Like if you're the protagonist of your story, is the protagonist moving forward or is the protagonist going in circles? Who are the heroes and who are the victims? And is that really true? Or is there more nuance to the story? And mostly, can you perspective take? Can you take the perspective of the other people involved in this story? And if they were telling me the same story, what would they say? And is there a piece of their story that rings true that maybe you don't want to look at because you have shame around that part of the story? So somebody might come in and they'll tell me a story, but they're leaving out an entire piece of the story that's very relevant, or they're emphasizing certain parts of the story and minimizing other parts of the story because they don't really want to get into the parts where maybe they could be making some changes.
yeah, I so relate to that because I think so many times we want to relinquish the responsibility and control of our own behavior and put it onto somebody else, like it's somebody else's fault and responsibility to fix us, right? It's our parents, it's our friends, it's our spouse, it's our exes, it's coworkers, whoever it is. But really, no one's going to change us till like we are ready to be the ones to actually do it. And I remember when I was in jail, and this you'll see where I'm going with this is I was in jail back in 2008 on felony drug charges, and I was a drug addict and I was selling all kinds of drugs, and I was blaming everybody in my life. I remember talking to my cellmate, and I was just like, who was a guy who actually like, he was kind of like Wendell for you in the book. This guy was a very just told me like it was, like, in a way that I didn't want to hear, but I needed to hear. So he was just like, I was like, it's my parents' fault. They got divorced, and I got bullied in school, and he looked at me and he said, the PG version, he's like, quit being a wuss. He's like, quit being a victim, right? He's like, you got yourself here. He said, there's plenty of other people who are in your situation who didn't wind up in jail. You are in jail. So you can either be a man, look yourself in the mirror and say it's on you, your responsibility, your choices, your decisions to grow, or you can go sit in the corner and cry. Like, which one do you want to do?
That's so powerful because the taking responsibility part is the part that so many of us have trouble with. So there's this moment with Wendell, who's my therapist, and I write about him. And he says to me at one point, I think so many of us, we come in and we feel like, yeah, I'm trapped by this situation, these circumstances. And he said to me, you remind me of this cartoon. And it's of a prisoner shaking the bars, desperately trying to get out. But on the right and the left, it's open, no bars. In other words, the prisoner isn't actually in jail. So why don't we walk around the bars? So many of us would rather just shake those bars and say, I'm in jail, I can't get out, right? Why don't we just look to the right or the left and walk around those bars? We don't want to look to the right and the left and see that it's open, because if we see that it's open, then we're free. But with freedom comes responsibility. Now we are responsible for our lives. We are responsible for our choices. And it's so much more comfortable sometimes to be able to blame somebody else for what doesn't go right in our lives than to say, oh, wait a minute, I'm responsible for that.
Yeah, and I think deep down, the funny thing, the ironic thing, I should say, is when we do that consciously, we know that we're only becoming more miserable. Like inside, we know that we should be taking responsibility. We should be changing the way we eat. We should be changing the way we respond to certain patterns or whatever it is. But it's just easier for our ego, or easier for our own self-image and self-esteem, to put blame on somebody else, because then it's like we almost temporarily feel better, but long term we feel worse, because then that just prolongs our own healing.
I think that sometimes the reason that we do that is because we feel like we should get a redo. Like we
Mm,
feel like this, in your case, your parents got divorced or whatever happened.
right.
And we feel like, I should get a redo. This wasn't fair. And maybe there were things that weren't fair when you were a kid. But when you're an adult, that happened, and then you have to decide what to do with that. Sure, that's going to shape you in some way, but how? There are lots of different ways that it can shape you, like what your Wendell in jail said to you, right? That other people have had the same situation, but they made different choices with it. And so once we let go of the hope for a better childhood, then we can have the agency we need to move forward and have a better future. But if we're going to cling to that, this is so unfair, I've been done wrong, and I want to redo, you're just punishing yourself. You're just
Mm,
keeping yourself in that position of, wow, I'm still the victim. Except this time you're doing it to yourself.
yeah, and there's nothing more paralyzing than being the victim, right? Because I think so many times we want to rewrite our past, and we can't. It's over. The only thing we can rewrite is the future. And it's about really swallowing our pride, checking our ego, and being like, you know what, I'm not really proud of some of the decisions I made, or I'm not proud of the way I was treated. But going forward, I'm going to change, for the better, and I'm going to stay committed to it. And you know, as a therapist, and I mean, for me as a coach, I think about this sometimes. Like, do you ever feel like I give such great advice? I wish I would take it. Like, I heard you talk in the book, you would give advice to your clients. And then I felt like Wendell was giving you some of the same advice, not specifically the same situations, but there was a lot of parallel between the two. I mean, so talk a bit about that. And then, because I mean, I feel like people are like, man, therapists, they must be the most perfect people ever. And we all know we're all human.
Well, it's funny. I think there are kind of two images of therapists out in the world. And, I don't know if you know, but they're making a television series of the book.
Yep.
Maybe you should talk to someone. And one thing that's really important to me is that it's a show about people who happen to be therapists and not about therapists. And the
Mm,
distinction is that I think that the misconceptions about therapists are either that, yeah, they have everything together, or the opposite, that they're total train wrecks, right? Like you've seen, oh, look, the therapist who's really good at what he or she does in the room with patients, but is like a hot mess outside the room. And I think neither of those is true. So I was going through something like people do. I say at the beginning of the book that my most significant credential is that I'm a card carrying member of the human race. I know what it's like to be a person in the world. I don't think anybody wants to go to a robot, but you also have to have worked through things in your life. And so I was going through a breakup, an unexpected breakup that turns out to not have been so unexpected, I discover in my therapy. And I think that, what therapy does is it gives you almost like a really good second opinion on your life from someone who's not already in your life. And so, even as a therapist, I'm too close to it. I'm too close to myself to see certain things sometimes. So, that's why it's important that therapists go to therapy. Just because you can see something with somebody else doesn't mean that you can see it with yourself, because you're too close to the situation. Even your friends and family are too.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you because, we can only tell the same story to ourselves so many times before we just kind of get bored with it ourselves. And same with other people in our lives that are closest to us. When you're complaining about the same person, the same situation, the same thing, and they're literally like, maybe you should go talk to someone, or maybe like subconsciously they're trying to tell us that without like saying it like out loud. And I think the one thing that's important for everybody to remember is like there's so much there used to be this huge stigma about going to therapy that you have issues or whatever if you go to therapy, but really it's more about like the changing the perspective like you talk about. It's about like personal growth and personal
Yeah.
development, right? And how you can continue to develop as a human and get better and grow. I mean, because if we're not growing, we're dying.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that we look at our emotional health differently from the way that we look at our physical health. So,
Mm,
if something feels off, let's say you have like some chest pain or something feels off in your body, you're going to go get it checked out before you have a massive heart attack. You're going to say,
right.
wait a minute, I need to go get that looked at. But if something feels off emotionally, you're feeling anxious, you're feeling sad, you're having relational difficulties, you're eating too much, or you're scrolling through the internet all day, whatever, like something is like not right, then yeah, you should get it checked out. But what we do is we minimize it. We say, well, it's not that bad. I have a roof over my head and food on the table, and other people have it worse. But we don't do that with our physical health. We don't say, like, yeah, I sprained my wrist, but other people have cancer, so I'm not going to go get this x-rayed and make sure it's not broken, right? You're not going to not go to the doctor because somebody else has it worse physically than you. And so I think that we need to really change the narrative around our emotional health and how important it is, because the quality of our lives and the quality of the lives around us as well depends on our being healthy emotionally. And so it's on every level. It's on a personal level, it's on a familial level, like who are the people that you're surrounding yourself with, and it's on a societal level too. And sort of the greater society is that really we are having a mental health crisis. And people now, I think, are noticing, because we've been, forced into this situation with the pandemic of, wow, I really need to pay attention, because now I know that I need help. But it shouldn't need to come to that. We don't need to have the equivalent of an emotional heart attack to go talk to a therapist.
Yeah, I mean, so about that, like, what kind of advice are you like? I mean, common advice are you giving to some of your clients to deal with the isolation? I mean, I know, like we talked about at the beginning, you're maybe connecting with people, but it's not the same as touch, right? I know you talk about in your book the importance of like human connection and physical touch. So, what kind of things are you giving your clients to do to kind of fill that void? We will get you back to this episode of the Adversity Advantage in just 1 second, but first wanted to give a quick shout out to Danette May and Earth Echo Foods. Danette was a past guest on the podcast and shared her incredible story and how it inspired her to create her products such as Cacao Bliss, which I take every day, either in my coffee or in a smoothie. It starts with 100% organic cacao beans that are naturally kissed by the sun, maintaining its miraculous health benefits. Then it's blended with turmeric, MCT oil, coconut, Himalayan sea salt, cinnamon, and black pepper for the perfect blend to make you feel the best you ever have. The result? Fall in love with a truly decadent, healthy, guilt-free chocolate, removing your cravings, facilitating weight loss, boosting your energy, and reducing your inflammation with one simple drink. Not only that, it is friendly to keto, gluten-free, paleo, vegan, and vegetarian diets. So go to earthechofoods.com/Doug Bopst. Again, earthechofoods.com/Doug Bopst. Check it out for yourself and learn more about the amazing benefits of Cacao Bliss. And when you enter in the promo code Doug at checkout, you'll get 15% off. Now back to the show.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I've been doing my sessions remotely, which before COVID, I was really opposed to,
Mm.
because it's kind of like a colleague said, that doing online therapy is like doing therapy with a condom on, because because it's right. It's not the same as like being in the physical space with
Yeah, yeah,
somebody where you hear each other breathe, you're seeing the same things.
right.
There's an intimacy to sitting a few feet apart from somebody in the room together with nobody else there, no distractions, no phones, no nothing beeping or pinging or anything. And you know therapy mediated through a screen is very different. I can't even see people's whole body, so like someone might say to me, oh no, I'm not anxious about that, but then they're like, their leg is going up and down, like they're like kicking their leg. That's a sign of anxiety, but I can't see that on a Zoom screen, for example. But what I've noticed is that there's a different kind of intimacy, which is that you see inside people's homes. And, as much as you try to make your office a very warm space, they're seeing inside my home, I'm seeing inside theirs. And I've discovered things about people, like maybe their partners or their children or their parents or whoever, roommates, whoever they're living with. Sometimes they like walk by in the background and I'm like, oh, that's what that person looks like. Or they have a little interaction with them. And it's a different kind of getting to know someone. And even something like there's somebody that I was seeing had a cello in the background every time we would log on. And I said, whose cello is that? And this person said, oh, it's mine. I play it every day for like an hour. And I thought, wow, I didn't know that about this person. So, I think that even though the in-person experience isn't the same as the online experience, I think that now is a really great time for people to reach out because it's so easy to access a therapist right now. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to deal with traffic, right? You don't have to deal with parking and all the sort of logistical pieces. So I do think that's important. And in terms of just people reaching out to other people, here's a little PSA that I think people should know about. I see a lot of couples in my practice, and I also see individuals. And a lot of times the people in the couples will say, I really love my partner, but like this person is driving me batty and I can't stand it. And I don't know, like I need outside people. And what I hear from people who are living by themselves or who are single, they'll say like, I'm going crazy and I don't want to bother my friends with like partners and kids because they're so busy and they have so much going on. Please call them. Please call the people who are in families because they want to hear from you. Don't hesitate to reach out. So, you know, I think that we make all these assumptions about who wants to hear from us or whether we're going to be a burden to people. And what I want to say about that is please reach out to people. You will discover very quickly who is very excited to hear from you. And maybe those friendships will deepen. And in a way that maybe you didn't even realize that there was a lot there because you guys were so busy and sort of the normal flow of life before this. And then there will be people who maybe, you'll realize, oh, we don't have as much there as I thought, but that's okay because you're going to start to really get to the essence of how is my life peopled and how can I grow those friendships and deepen those friendships.
Yeah, I think you're so right. In the pandemic now, it's either deepening relationships or it's like cutting them off, right? Because you're realizing you're really realizing who's really there for you, and hopefully people are learning to embrace the great people that we have in our lives. Because you touched on earlier on in our conversation about the importance of who we surround ourselves with. So you touched on the TV series. How did that all come about? Did you have a vision of the series before you wrote the book, like, or did it come about like as the book became more popular, or did you have a relationship with Eva Longoria? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, no, I wasn't thinking at all about a TV series when I was writing the book. I was originally supposed to be writing a happiness book, ironically. And as I write about in maybe shock to someone, that the happiness book just made me miserable. It literally made me depressed, which is
Mm,
ironic. But I called it the miserable depression-inducing happiness book because I couldn't get myself to write it because I felt like it was just scratching the surface of something that I was seeing every day in the therapy room, which was real life. And it was these heroic moments that happen in the therapy room, which looks very different from this vague concept of happiness.
mm.
Happiness as a byproduct of living our lives in a way that's meaningful is what we all strive for. But happiness as the goal in and of itself is often a recipe for disappointment. And so I was really getting at more of, in this book, more of, what does it mean to be human and how do we what are our blind spots? How do we self-sabotage? How do we get through our struggles? What does that really look like? Which isn't about studies and this and that. It's really about here are some stories you can read about people who have done that because I think you're going to see yourself in those stories. And so I didn't think about it as a TV series, but when later when Eva Longoria wanted to do it, it seemed like, of course it would be a TV series because therapy is almost like that. Think about like the episodic nature of television. Like you watch, if you're not binge watching, right? Like let's say that you're watching a show and then there's a new episode, right? That's what therapy is like. It's like these stories that these are these character arcs that go on in our lives, and they're real. And that's why good television resonates so strongly with people, because it mirrors something that we experience in the arc of our lives. It's very nuanced, as opposed to like a movie. In TV, you have a much longer time to develop the characters, to see the nuances, to see all the plot twists and the ways that our stories kind of get derailed and get back on track and go on a completely different track sometimes. That's what it's like being a therapist and being witness to people's lives. So I think it lends itself very naturally to a TV series.
Yeah, and especially to have to twist in like a comedy approach to it as well, I think will help shed some light on like how therapy isn't just like super serious, right? There is like
No,
right?
right.
It's all about the relationship, right? Like, I mean, it's all, like, just like you talk about in your book, your relationship with Wendell, like if you guys didn't have a connection, there wouldn't have been as much progress and growth, because there just wouldn't have been, you wouldn't have seen eye to eye on certain things. And then like, it just kind of, you guys would have split. And the same thing goes with like any other, I think, practice where you're in the relationship business, where you have clients that it's like, okay, there has to be some chemistry. There has to be some sort of kind of connection. So,
Well, the thing about the relationship is that when you're really making changes, there's going to be some discomfort.
mm,
And so, and I want people to orient towards something that feels uncomfortable, because that's the place where you're going to grow from. If you're just comfortable and you're just kind of going along, right, you're not going to move or change. You're not going to get outside of that comfort zone to do something that might be better for you. And so you want to be on that edge of where there's some discomfort, but not so much discomfort that you're so intimidated that you're not going to try something new. It's almost like most big transformations come about from the hundreds of tiny, almost imperceptible steps that we take along the way. So that's that edge of discomfort, right? You're a little bit uncomfortable, and you have someone there supporting you through that discomfort so that you can take that step and grow and transform. And that's where I think that relationship is so important. And study after study shows that the most important factor in the success of your therapy is indeed the relationship that you have with your therapist.
absolutely. And talking about getting uncomfortable, I want to talk about accountability. And I feel like there's two sides, right? At least on social media, there's like either the side where you have to be hardcore self accountable to yourself, or there's like the self love, like don't worry about it, just love yourself. And I don't see any blend, but I've heard you talk about how you can have both, and why I feel like it's like the secret sauce. So talk a bit about like how you can really incorporate accountability and compassion to grow emotionally.
Right. So a lot of people think that you have to self-flagellate, to hold
Yeah.
yourself accountable. And that's not true at all. And then a lot of people don't understand that self-compassion actually includes a lot of accountability. It's not
Mm,
just like, oh, love yourself no matter what you do or how you are.
right.
No.
Yeah.
Um, so, so it's interesting because when I give talks, I'll often say, to the audience, who is the person that you talk to most in the course of your life? Is it your partner? Is it your parent? Is it your sibling? Is it your best friend? Is it, your child, whoever it is, right? Your adult child? Who is it that you talk to most in the course of your life? And I get a lot of hands for those, but really the person that we talk to most in the course of our lives is ourselves. It's
Mm,
ourselves. And so what we say to ourselves isn't always kind or true or helpful. And so I had this client and she was very self critical, but she could not see it. So I said, listen, I want you to go home and I want you to write down everything you say to yourself in the course of a few days and come back and tell me about it. And so she comes back the next week and she starts to read it. She says, I can't even read this. I am such a bully to myself. And, things that she would say to herself, like, oh my God, you're so stupid, for like this minor mistake that she made, where it's like, if anyone else did that, we would not actually think they were stupid, not even close. Or just like, oh, you look horrible. You shouldn't go out like this, And if we saw a friend looking like that, we wouldn't think twice about it. And so we're so hard on ourselves that way. But that doesn't mean we don't hold ourselves accountable. So you can be kind to yourself. Is it kind? Is it true? Is it helpful? Really good questions to ask, and to notice that radio station playing in the background all the time in our minds. And do you want to change the radio station if you're playing this sort of, abusive radio station? You don't need to listen to that. But at the same time, you have to say, okay, I'm going to look at myself and I'm going to be kind even when I know there's room for growth. So what happens is often it's our shame that prevents us from looking at where we need to grow. And so we say, oh, I'm just going to love myself and I'm not going to look at that thing. But really what we're doing is we're sitting on like a massive ball of shame. And so what we need to do is, it's kind of like what I do with people in therapy is, you know, we like to say insight is the booby prize of therapy, meaning you can have all the insight in the world, but if you don't make changes out in the world, the insight is useless. So somebody might say like, now I understand why I keep getting into that fight with this person. And they'll come back and I'll say, well, did you do something different? They'll say, no, but I understand why I did that. And I was kinder to myself, you know, and I'll be like, that's great that you were kinder to yourself. But at the same time, you have to do something different, right? And what people don't realize is that the kinder you are to yourself, the less shame you're going to have. So you're not going to feel so much shame, and then you're going to be able to say, okay, I can look at this thing that's hard to look at, and now I'm going to be able to change it. When we self-flagellate, we don't look at anything. We're just kind of like, do this, do that, do this. You know, you're terrible. Do it this way. That might last for the short term. It's almost like New Year's resolutions. They don't last very long. But if you can be kind to yourself and also say, and I'm going to, I care about myself so much that I'm going to hold myself responsible for this. That's the sweet spot.
And I think you're right. I think the biggest thing that, we do as people that can tear our own selves down is the way we talk to ourselves, is the way that we communicate with ourselves on a daily basis. And I think if we were to talk to our friends the way we would talk to ourselves, sometimes we would be even more isolated than we are now. Can you imagine
Right.
just every person in your life? You're like, you're so stupid. You're this, you're that, you're fat. You're like, man, we would be so isolated. And one of the things I wanted to ask you about is people would, I'm sure would typically come in from depression and anxiety or whatever. And the cause could be school, the cause could be their job, the cause could be relationships. What effect now are you seeing with social media? Like, are people coming in and saying, I'm addicted to my phone, or I am anxious because I'm looking at people's like profiles on Instagram? Are you seeing any of that?
I'm seeing that a lot of people are trying to fill something up with something else. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to numb their feelings. So people might be feeling all kinds of things right now, that intense loneliness, sadness, anxiety. And, we need to use our feelings like a compass because our feelings tell us what we want. And so if you're anxious, you can say, okay, I need to do something about my anxiety. Maybe I need to reach out to someone. Maybe I need to exercise. What do I need? Maybe I need to call a therapist. What do I need to do right now? But if we ignore it, we try kind of stuff it down and we think it's gone away, that feeling, but actually it hasn't. So numbness isn't nothingness. Numbness is it's a sense of being overwhelmed by too many feelings, not having no feelings. And so what we do with those feelings that we've stuffed down is it comes out in other ways. It comes out in insomnia. It comes out in, like a short temperedness with the people around you. It comes out in too much food or wine
Mm.
or that mindless scrolling on the internet, which a colleague of mine says that the internet is the most effective short-term non-prescription painkiller out there. Right. So what we do is we try to fill this hole with a distraction. And what we don't realize is that might work in the very short term, but it just makes the problem worse. So if you can sit with the feeling and identify the feeling and not be so afraid of the feeling, because sometimes I think, the feeling itself is scarier than, like, I mean, the fear of the feeling is scarier than the feeling itself. So we're so afraid of the feeling, but the feeling isn't actually that scary. And so if we can sit with the feeling and say, what is this telling me that I need right now? And that's how you can use your feelings effectively. So the goal is to feel the feelings, to not drown in the feelings, but to say, how can I, what is it telling me? What can I do right now? And everybody has different things that they can do. And if they don't have that toolkit, right? If they don't know what they can do with those feelings, that's when it's really important. Can you reach out to someone? Can you reach out to another person that you know is a good person to talk to? And we know that there are good audiences and bad audiences. Pick a good audience, right? And then if you don't have those people in your life, can you reach out to a therapist? Even if you do have those people in your life, a therapist could be really useful, especially right now.
Feeling the feelings. Yeah. It's like so many people when they go through pain or they go through adversity, they want to just push it away and say, you know what, I want this to go away as fast as possible. But really, it just prolongs the pain even more because now we're not really sitting in it. And when we move on to whether it's a next relationship, a next job, whatever, it's going to carry on with us into that. And then it's going to just be this, snowball effect where you're taking this golf ball sized problem and it's now becoming a big bowling ball because of your inability or patience, I guess, to kind of deal with it. And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about or ask you about is your view on envy, because I actually heard you share, I think it was on Jay's podcast. It was very actually insightful on how envy can kind of be a compass too. And envy gets a bad rap because it's like this, this negative emotion, and people who are envious, they're bad and negative. But talk a bit about how it can actually be really positive for people to really change.
Yeah. So you're right that I think we place a value on different kinds of experiences that we have. So
Mm,
anxiety and sadness, we always say, oh, those are bad. Let's get rid of them. As opposed to,
right.
wow, this could be really useful. Same with envy. So a lot of people have a lot of shame around feeling envy because they feel like, well, I shouldn't feel that. That makes me a selfish person, or I should be happy for that other person. But envy is really useful because it tells you what you want. When you feel envy, it's because somebody else has something that you want in your life too. And so you can use that to say, oh, sometimes what we do with envy is we say, I don't like them very much, or they didn't deserve that, right? And we make all kinds of, like, we kind of put them down. Like they shouldn't have that, right? But instead, it's really helpful to say, wait a minute, if I want something like that, what are the steps that I can take in my own life to get closer to having whatever version of that I want in my life? And if we don't actually let ourselves experience the envy, we don't know what we want. We just sit there, putting down everybody else or talking about why they didn't deserve what they have. And it's a very negative space to be in, and it doesn't move you forward in any way.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And again, it's about perspective. It's like, okay, like how can we shift to make it a positive thing? Maybe you're envious of, the way somebody was able to write a book, or you're envious of a family. Why not twist it around and be like, okay, like how can I maybe change this and talk to them, and maybe, tell them how much I respect and admire them, and maybe some top lessons and tips on how I can get to that place, so that, again, getting back to the beginning of our conversation, so that I can actually take responsibility and control and do the work to get to that place. So I wanted to know, I was dying to ask you this. You have such a great gift at storytelling, and it was very obvious in your book. Have you any stories since the book, or anything during COVID that, like, either with yourself or maybe like a client, that you'd be willing to share?
Well, I have this new podcast. It's called Dear Therapist.
Yep.
And so every week people can hear stories. And I get to hear this all the time because I'm a therapist, but
Right.
a lot of people don't get to hear this. And I think what's really great is that every letter that we pick, I do it with Guy Winch, who, we've both
Mhm.
done these TED Talks, and people may know him from his TED Talks or his books as well. And what we do is, he writes the advice column for TED. I write the advice column for the Atlantic, but
Right.
for sort of what happens after we give the advice. And so when we talk about story, I think there's a satisfaction of knowing, well, how does the story progress? Like, what happens? What's the next, when we're talking about television, like what's the next episode? And so what we do is people get to hear us as therapists sort of talk people through their dilemmas. They get to hear the two of us as therapists talk without the person there about sort of how we think about their problem. And then we give them suggestions that they have to try within a week, and then they come back and they tell us how it went. And
Wow.
so much to learn from what they took from that conversation, and what they did in terms of, our suggestions, and then what worked and also what didn't work. Because sometimes we're wrong, right? Or sometimes they did something even better than what we thought of because they were shifted by something we said in the conversation. And so I feel like that is a weekly, almost storytelling session on Dear Therapist, because what you're hearing is these very real stories. And then
Mm.
it's not just a static story. And then how do we move this story to the next chapter?
Yeah, I mean, I actually, listened to a couple episodes of your podcast and knew you had that too. And I think it's interesting the way you do it, because it's not just like you do it, and bring people on where you're talking to them. You literally, like, people write into you, and then you give them feedback. And I think the homework thing is important, because I think, so many times, like, people will come onto a show like that, you'll give them advice, and then, like, you maybe run into them like 6 months later, and they're like, oh, like, how'd that go? And they're like, oh, I don't want to talk about it. But I think it's got to be pretty, like, rewarding, like, a week later, for them to be like, wow, like, I actually implemented, like, this gratitude thing, or I actually did, change the way I talk to myself, or I went for a walk, or whatever advice you give them. and wow, my life already, I can just see a noticeable difference in my attitude, my energy, and the way I carry myself. Because I think like there's so many, we're just looking a lot of times for validation, and sometimes we go about it in a negative way, but validation can actually be very positive. Because if you are kind of talking to a professional like yourself about things you might already know, and then you're kind of reaffirming that, I think sometimes it can give us the validation we need to actually make a positive, change. And, what do you think is missing right now the mental health aspect? Because I think right now our mental health is at like an all-time high. Our mental health epidemic, I should say, is at an all-time high. People are as anxious and depressed and stressed as ever. What kind of things do you think they're missing that people could kind of do like right now if it was just a few things?
Well, as we talk about sort of like the book and the podcast, and I think about this common theme of
Yeah,
people feeling stuck.
right.
People come to you when they feel stuck. They feel like, I am in this
Mm,
situation and I don't know where to go with it. And so I think that a lot of people right now during COVID are just feeling stuck. And one of the things, going back to what we were talking about with, how we label our emotions. So let's take anxiety. There are two kinds of anxiety. There's productive anxiety. There's actually a really good kind of anxiety, which is it's when you are reasonably worried about something and is productive because it makes you take action to protect yourself. So we are reasonably worried about getting COVID. So we are wearing masks and we are, social distancing and doing all the things that we need to do to take care of our physical immune systems. Then there's unproductive anxiety, which is obsessive rumination. It's kind of like what we talked about before, that sort of like how do we, the distractions, right? And
mm.
so the distraction from like doing something productive is we are going to check the headlines every hour, or we are going to, distract ourselves with all the typical things, whatever, pick your addiction. It could be, online shopping, alcohol, whatever, you pick it.
TikTok,
Food,
yeah.
whatever, TikTok, whatever,
Yeah, okay.
you name it. And then what happens is it's like this obsessive rumination. You're just ruminating and ruminating and ruminating about something. And it might not even be about COVID. Like it might be about like that thing that your partner said to you that you can't get
Mm,
over. You're like, I can't believe they said that. And you won't let it go. And it's like this obsessive rumination about sort of what happened. And that's really unproductive because it doesn't help you to take action and do something different. And so I think during COVID, it's really important to say, how am I using whatever I'm feeling in a productive way? And that I think will be most helpful, because right now, again, and maybe that means I want to go talk to a therapist, because sometimes we just can't, we all have blind spots and we just can't see something that somebody else can see. We can't see how to get unstuck from the place that we're at, but it might not be that complicated. And
yeah.
so like even one small change, and especially on the podcast because it's so immediate, you see it right away. You can see that, like, let's just look at the situation this way, whether it's like, heartbreak, like this is on our podcast, like, heartbreak or stepchildren or infidelity or whatever it is. Just look at it in this way that you haven't been able to see it, and then let's see what changes, right? And so I think that people feel like always like, I have to make a big change or else it's not worth it. No, you don't. Even a small change will have a huge effect.
Absolutely. And I think we are stuck, right? I totally agree. We feel like, all right, like, can we go in this place? Can we go in that place? Are they gonna, are schools gonna be public? Are they gonna be online? Are we able to go to a restaurant? We have to wear a mask? When we travel, can we do this? There's so many questions that we've never really had before that and we're like, we feel like stuck because it's like we don't have control. And I think as humans, when we feel like we don't have control over something, we try to control it even more. And then when we try to control the uncontrollables, we lose control of what we can control. And I think
Well,
the thing, right?
here's the thing, we never had control.
Right. Well,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
that's something really important. I think people find this like with love too. They feel like, I want to be in a
Mm,
risk-free relationship.
right.
There's no such thing. If you're, love, inherent to love is some lack of control, some vulnerability. There's always risk if you want love. And so the same thing right now, that we're in this situation that feels very vulnerable. And so humans don't do well with uncertainty. We
Mm,
don't like that. We want everything to be certain. But we're going to have to get much more comfortable with uncertainty, and not try to change the fact that things are uncertain, but to change how we respond to things being uncertain.
Yeah, and I think you're right. Like as humans, as people, I know myself. Like when you don't know something or something's uncertain, it kind of causes this massive insecurity, and it kind of stirs inside of you. And I think it's up to us that we talked about at the beginning of our choices. How are we going to deal with it? Are we going to connect with great people? Are we going to exercise? Are we going to eat well? Are we going to listen to podcasts? Are we going to go see someone? Like, what are we going to do to help alleviate that anxiety and that stress? So this show's up and coming, right? When's it set to come out? Like when's it set to be released? Is it gonna be this year? Is it gonna be next year?
We don't have a date yet. It's in progress.
Okay, that's awesome.
Yeah,
Well,
it's being written.
I think what's really fascinating is it's all kind of come back full circle for you, that you started like in the media business, you get into therapy, you write this book, and then now you're back in the media business, if you will, like with your TV series. And I just got to say, like, it's incredible to watch like the growth. I mean, just somebody that, I mean, just from someone who's in the process now of like trying to continue to grow and evolve with my own podcast and my writing and everything, and just seeing somebody who's actually really done it, it's really admirable. So like, I mean, I really do thank you for coming on here, sharing not only your story, your expertise, opening up with some vulnerability. I mean, it was so appreciated.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I so enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. So I will make sure to put all the links to the podcast, to your column at the Atlantic, your book, obviously, and your social media stuff in the notes on the podcast. And, for those listening, if you're in that position where you're feeling stuck and you're not so sure of what to do, and you kind of don't know who to talk to, don't know who to turn to, maybe it is like legitimately time to go talk to someone. And even now, like during COVID, like you don't have to have the worry. I mean, one of the worries for me was always like, am I going to see someone I know in the waiting room? Like that insecurity, right? Like you don't have that anymore. You don't have like the traffic. You don't have the parking. It's just all online on Zoom. And it's like, we think that we will hate it, but we actually learn to kind of appreciate it because we're in the comfort of our own home. You can like, just kind of just sit here and be more relaxed. So, but what I am more encourage you to do is to read Lori's book, give her a follow on social media because she posts some great content. Check out her podcast. She's absolutely hilarious and real, which we need more of. So Lori, once again, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah. And just one final note, we always love feedback. We always love to hear what you thought of this episode. So if you really enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you as well. And, reach out to Lori or myself. And once again, you're listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we will see you next time.